Hey everyone! Welcome back to the channel. I'm really glad you're here. Today's story is one you won't forget. On the day my husband died, I said nothing about the $28 million inheritance and the luxury properties in the city that were secretly registered in my name. That very night my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eyes and yelled, "Pack your bags. Get out of this house." I simply said, "Okay." But what I did next changed everything. And it's something she will regret for the rest of her life. What really happened behind that door? Why did I stay silent? And what did I do that turned the entire situation upside down? This story is full of shocking twists, emotional moments, and a payoff you won't see coming. So make sure you watch until the very end. If you enjoy dramatic, satisfying stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Now let's begin. "Pack your bags and get out of this house tonight," my daughter-in-law said, her voice sharp and steady, as if she had been rehearsing that sentence for years, and I simply looked at her, nodded once and said, "All right," because in that moment I realized something she didn't know, something I had kept to myself even on the day we buried my husband just hours earlier, something that would change everything by morning. I'm Margaret Whitmore, 71 years old, and that evening, as the last of the condolences faded and the house grew quiet, I sat at the same mahogany dining table where my family had gathered for decades, now reduced to 3 people who felt like strangers, the air still carrying faint traces of casserole dishes and sympathy flowers, and yet none of that mattered compared to the way Ashley sat across from me, her posture straighter than usual, her eyes no longer pretending kindness, while my son Daniel remained beside her, silent, staring down at his plate as if the pattern on the china required his full attention. Earlier that day, I had stood beside my husband Edward's grave, listening to the pastor speak about a life well lived, about legacy and family, about love that endures, and I had held Daniel's hand then, feeling him squeeze mine just once, but now that same hand rested flat on the table, unmoving, as if even that small connection had been buried along with his father. Ashley cleared her throat before delivering her sentence, the one that still echoed in my ears, and there was no hesitation, no softness, just a clean, deliberate cut through whatever remained of decency, and I noticed how she didn't look surprised by her own words, as if this moment had been inevitable to her, something she had been waiting for, and perhaps she had, because in the months leading up to Edward's passing, there had been small changes, things I had chosen not to question at the time, like the way Ashley began referring to the house as our place, instead of your home. Or how Daniel stopped including me in conversations about renovations, finances, future plans, all of it happening quietly, politely, almost invisibly, until tonight when the mask finally slipped. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate, my hands steady, my breathing even, because I had learned long ago that not every battle is meant to be fought out loud, and certainly not at a dinner table still set with the remnants of a funeral meal. And when I stood up, neither of them stopped me, neither of them said a word. And that silence told me more than anything else could have. So I walked upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with Edward for 42 years, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed where he had reached for my hand just a week ago and told me, in a voice weaker than I had ever heard, "Everything is taken care of." And at the time I thought he meant the arrangements, the paperwork, the things people say when they are trying to ease the burden of leaving. But now as I looked around that room at the photographs, the dresser, the quiet weight of a life built over decades, I understood there had been more behind those words, and I realized that while Ashley believed she had just forced me out of my own home, she had no idea what was actually in my name, no idea what Edward had prepared long before any of this, and no idea that by telling me to leave, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I did not sleep that night, not because of what Ashley had said, but because of how easily it had been said, as if I had already been erased long before she ever spoke the words out loud. And as I sat in the dim light of the bedroom, I could hear faint movements downstairs, cabinets opening and closing, low voices drifting through the floorboards, and it struck me that they were already making plans, already moving forward, as if I were no longer part of this house, as if I were nothing more than a temporary guest who had overstayed her welcome, and yet everything around me told a different story. Every drawer I had organized, every photograph I had framed, every corner of this home that carried the imprint of a life I had built with Edward over 4 decades. I stood slowly and walked toward his side of the dresser, where his watch still rested exactly where he had left it, the leather band slightly worn, the face catching the soft glow of the bedside lamp, and I reached out, not to pick it up but just to touch it, to remind myself that what we had built had been real, even if it no longer mattered to anyone else in this house. And that was when his words came back to me again, clearer this time, steadier. Everything is taken care of? Not said in fear, not said in haste, but with that quiet certainty he had always carried, the same certainty that had guided every major decision in our lives. And I realized then that Edward had never been a man to leave things unfinished, never been someone who trusted chance when it came to protecting his family, especially me. I moved to the closet and opened the small safe tucked behind a row of coats, something I had not touched in months, not since before the hospital visits became routine, and as I turned the dial and pulled the door open, I found exactly what I expected and yet somehow still felt unprepared to face. A set of documents neatly arranged, folders labeled in Edward's precise handwriting, and I sat down on the floor with them, the quiet of the room wrapping around me as I began to read, slowly at first, then more carefully, making sure I understood every line, every signature, every detail, and with each page the picture became clearer, the structure of what he had done, the way he had positioned everything, not in Daniel's name, not in any shared account, but in mine, properties across the city, accounts I had never questioned, numbers that felt distant and abstract until now, until this moment when I realized what they actually meant. Downstairs, I heard Ashley laugh softly, a sound that carried just enough confidence to tell me she believed she had already won, and I closed the folder gently, placing it back into the safe with the same care I had used to open it, because there was no urgency in my movements, no panic, only a growing sense of clarity, and as I stood up, I caught my reflection in the mirror, the same silver hair, the same lined face, but something in my eyes had shifted, something quieter and firmer, and I understood that while they were busy deciding how quickly I should leave, I was the one who would decide what happened next, not with anger, not with raised voices, but with something far more effective, patience, because by morning, I would no longer be the woman they thought they could dismiss. I would be the one holding everything they believed already belonged to them. By morning, the house felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because I had, and I moved through the kitchen quietly, the same way I had done for years, setting a kettle on the stove, placing a cup on the counter, following routines that no one else seemed to notice or value. And when Ashley walked in, already dressed and composed, she paused just long enough to glance at me, her expression polite but distant, as if I were someone passing through rather than someone who had lived in that space longer than she had known my son, and she leaned against the counter with a casual confidence that did not belong to her. Not yet, not truly, but she wore it anyway, asking, "Have you thought about where you will go?" in a tone that suggested the decision had already been made for me, and I stirred my tea slowly before answering, "I will make arrangements," because there was no need to give her more than that, no need to reveal anything behind those words, and Daniel entered a moment later, his tie slightly crooked, his eyes avoiding mine again, and I noticed how quickly he aligned himself beside her, how naturally he stood at her side instead of mine, as if the shift had happened long before I chose to see it, and he cleared his throat, mentioning something about giving me 2 weeks, about helping me find a place, about making the transition easier, and I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood that this was not a negotiation, at least not from their perspective. And as they spoke about timelines and logistics, about how the house would need updates, how they had been thinking about opening up the living room, replacing the cabinets, changing things that had been carefully chosen over decades, I realized that in their minds I was already gone, reduced to a minor inconvenience standing in the way of their plans, and that realization did not hurt the way it might have once. It clarified something instead, something clean and undeniable. And when I finished my tea, I placed the cup in the sink, wiped the counter, and turned to Ashley, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since the night before, and I said, 2 weeks will be more than enough. And she smiled then, a small, satisfied smile that she did not bother to hide, while Daniel let out a breath he had been holding, as if relief had finally settled in his chest, and I could see it clearly now, the way they believed this was over, the way they thought the hardest part had already passed. And as I walked past them toward the hallway, I heard Ashley begin to talk about furniture, about which pieces they might keep and which ones they would replace, her voice light, almost excited, and I paused for just a second, not long enough for them to notice, just long enough for me to take in the sound of it. The certainty, the assumption, the quiet certainty that everything in this house was about to become theirs, and then I continued walking because there was nothing left to say, nothing that needed to be explained, and as I reached the stairs, I understood something with complete clarity. They were planning a future that depended entirely on me leaving quietly, but what they did not understand was that I had already decided how I would leave, and it would not be the way they expected. That afternoon, I drove alone for the first time since the funeral, my hand steady on the wheel, the quiet hum of the engine filling the silence that used to be occupied by Edward's voice, and I followed a route I had taken many times before, past the same tree-lined streets, the same small shops, the same familiar corners of a city that had slowly become part of our life together, until I pulled into a parking space in front of a modest brick building downtown, one that did not draw attention to itself, one that most people would pass without a second glance, and I sat there for a moment before stepping out, smoothing my coat, adjusting my posture, not out of nervousness but out of habit, because Edward had always believed that the way you carried yourself mattered, especially when you were about to handle something important, and when I pushed open the glass door, I was greeted by a quiet lobby and a receptionist who looked up with a polite smile that shifted almost immediately into recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore, we have been expecting you," she said, and that simple sentence confirmed everything I had begun to understand the night before, that Edward had not only prepared documents, he had prepared people, processes, a structure that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. And I was led into a private office where a man in his early 60s stood as I entered, extending his hand with a calm professionalism that matched the tone Edward had always trusted. "Margaret, I am Charles Bennett," he said. "Your husband asked me to handle everything personally when the time came." And I nodded, taking a seat across from him, placing my handbag carefully beside the chair, because there was no rush in my movements, no urgency in my voice when I said, "I believe it is time we reviewed what he left in my name." And he opened a folder, not searching, not hesitating, as if he had already anticipated every question I might ask, and as he began to speak, outlining the accounts, the properties, the legal structures that had been established quietly over the years, I listened without interruption, absorbing each detail, each confirmation that what I had seen the night before was only part of a much larger design, and when he mentioned the total valuation, the number itself did not shock me as much as the realization of what it represented, not just wealth but control, security, independence, and most importantly, choice. And for the first time since Ashley's voice had cut through the dining room the night before, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not satisfaction but clarity, the kind that removes doubt completely. And when Charles paused, looking at me as if waiting for a reaction, I simply asked, "What needs to be done to ensure everything remains exactly as it is, with no changes, no access, no assumptions made by anyone else?" And he gave a small, understanding nod, as if he had heard that question before in different forms from different people, but recognized the intention behind mine. And he assured me that every asset was secured, every title clearly defined, every account requiring my authorization and mine alone, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that information settle fully, because this was not about acting quickly, this was about acting precisely. And as I stood to leave, thanking him with a calmness that surprised even me, I understood that while Ashley and Daniel were rearranging furniture in their minds, imagining a future built on assumptions, I was quietly ensuring that every piece of that future rested entirely on a foundation they did not control. And as I stepped back out onto the street, the afternoon light falling softly across the pavement, I realized that for the first time since Edward had taken his last breath, I was not reacting to what had been done to me, I was deciding what would happen next. When I returned home that evening, nothing looked different, and yet everything had shifted in a way that only I could feel, as if the walls themselves were holding a secret that the others could not see. And I stepped inside quietly, setting my keys in their usual place, removing my coat with the same measured movements I had practiced for years, because there was comfort in routine, especially when everything else had begun to change. And from the living room I could hear Ashley's voice again. Lighter now, almost cheerful, discussing something about paint colors and furniture layouts. And when I walked in, she glanced at me briefly before turning back to her phone, continuing her conversation without pause, as if my presence required no acknowledgement. And Daniel sat nearby, scrolling through something on his tablet, his posture relaxed in a way I had not seen since before Edward became ill. And that detail did not escape me, the ease, the absence of tension, as if my removal from the equation had already simplified their lives. I asked no questions, offered no commentary, simply moved through the space that had once been mine, observing quietly, noting how quickly they had begun to reshape it in their minds, and Ashley ended her call with a small laugh before looking at me and saying, "We were just talking about opening up the dining room, making it more modern," and I nodded slightly, as if considering the idea, even though I knew that every decision she was describing rested on an assumption she had not yet questioned, and Daniel added something about contractors, about timelines, about how it would be better to start renovations as soon as possible, and I listened without interruption, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to challenge, not yet. Later that evening, I packed a small suitcase, not hurriedly, not with emotion, but with intention, choosing only what I needed for the next few days, because I had no plans to disappear, only to reposition, and as I folded each item, I thought about the documents I had reviewed earlier, the structure Edward had put in place, the quiet certainty behind every decision he had made, and I realized that what he had given me was not just protection, it was time, the ability to move without pressure, to act without revealing anything prematurely, and when I closed the suitcase, I placed it by the door, not hidden, not announced, simply there, visible enough to confirm what they already believed. The next morning, Ashley noticed it immediately, her eyes lingering on it with a subtle satisfaction she did not bother to disguise, and she asked, "You are leaving early?" And I replied, "Just for a few days," keeping my tone even, offering no further explanation, and Daniel nodded as if this made everything easier, as if my temporary absence aligned perfectly with their plans, and I could see it clearly now, the way they were already adjusting to a version of the house without me in it, already stepping into roles they believed were rightfully theirs, and I allowed that belief to remain untouched, because it served a purpose, because every assumption they made, without question, gave me more space to move without interference, and as I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the door, I paused just long enough to look back at the room, at the furniture, the walls, the life that had been built there, and I felt no need to hold on to it in that moment, no urgency to claim it, because I understood something they did not. Ownership was not determined by who stood in the room, it was determined by whose name was written where it mattered most. And as the door closed quietly behind me, I knew that while they believed I was stepping away, I was simply stepping into position. I checked into a small hotel on the east side of the city, the kind of place that did not ask many questions and did not offer unnecessary attention, and, as I set my suitcase down on the bed, I felt a quiet sense of distance settle in, not just from the house, but from everything that had unfolded inside it, and for the first time in days, the silence around me belonged entirely to me, not shaped by someone else's expectations or conversations that no longer included me, and I sat by the window for a while, watching the steady movement of cars below, people walking with purpose, lives continuing without interruption, and it reminded me that nothing had actually stopped, not the world, not time, and certainly not the decisions that still needed to be made. Later that afternoon I made a call, one that I had considered carefully, not out of hesitation but out of precision, because timing mattered now more than ever, and when Charles answered, his voice calm and attentive, I did not waste words. I simply said, "I would like to proceed with securing full control over all active properties and accounts, effective immediately." And there was no surprise in his response, only a brief pause followed by a professional acknowledgement, as if he had been expecting this exact request, and he began outlining the steps, the confirmations, the authorizations required, each one reinforcing what I already understood, that everything was already positioned in my favor, it only needed to be activated. I listened carefully, confirming each detail, not rushing through any part of it, because this was not about reacting quickly, it was about ensuring that nothing could be undone once it was set in motion. And when the call ended, I placed the phone down and sat still for a moment, letting the weight of that decision settle, not heavy, not overwhelming, but solid, like placing the final piece into something that had been quietly forming long before I fully saw it. That evening, I received a message from Daniel, short and practical, asking if I had found somewhere suitable, mentioning that they had already scheduled a consultation with a contractor, and I read it once, then set the phone aside without replying immediately, because there was no urgency in answering, no need to correct the assumptions behind his words, and I imagined the house as it must have looked at that moment, Ashley moving through the rooms with new ideas, pointing out changes, making plans, speaking with a confidence that came from believing there would be no resistance, and Daniel following along, adjusting, accepting, choosing the easier path as he always had when faced with quiet conflict. The next morning, another call came from Charles, confirming that the necessary protections had been put in place, that all properties were now under strict authorization, that no transfers, no modifications, no access could occur without my direct approval, and I thanked him with the same calm tone I had used from the beginning. Because this was not a moment that required celebration, it required awareness, and as I stood by the window again, looking out at the city that now felt different in a way I could not fully explain, I realized that the balance had already shifted, not visibly, not in a way that Ashley or Daniel could see, but fundamentally, in a way that would reveal itself soon enough, and as I reached for my coat, preparing to step out, I understood that everything from this point forward would unfold exactly as it needed to, not because of chance but because I had decided it would. 2 days passed before I returned to the house, not because I needed more time, but because I wanted them to settle into their assumptions, to grow comfortable inside a version of reality that would soon shift beneath them. And when I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, I noticed the small details first: the contractor's truck parked near the curb, the front door slightly ajar, the sound of voices carrying faintly from inside, and I stepped out of the car with the same calm pace I had maintained from the beginning, not announcing myself, not rushing, simply walking in as if nothing had changed, because in truth, nothing had changed in the way that mattered. Ashley was standing in the living room with a man holding a clipboard, gesturing toward the walls, explaining what she wanted removed, what she wanted replaced, her voice confident, decisive, as if she had already been living there for years instead of weeks. And when she saw me, she paused only briefly, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing into something polite but strained. "Oh, you are back," she said, as if my return had not been expected so soon, and I nodded lightly, setting my handbag on the table, taking in the scene without comment while Daniel stood nearby, offering the contractor a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes, as if he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same moment, one where I had already left for good, and one where I was standing right in front of him. "We thought it would be a good time to start planning," Ashley added, her tone casual, but there was something underneath it now, something less certain than before, and I could see it clearly, the first small crack in her confidence, the beginning of a question she had not yet formed, and I simply replied, "Planning is important," before turning slightly toward the contractor, offering him a polite greeting that shifted the attention away from her and back into neutral ground, and he responded with professional courtesy, unaware of the tension that had settled quietly between us. As they continued discussing measurements and timelines, I walked slowly through the house, moving from one room to another, not inspecting, not claiming, simply observing, and I noticed the subtle changes already beginning to take shape: notes taped to walls, furniture slightly repositioned, the early signs of a transformation they believed was inevitable. And I let them continue, let them speak, let them plan, because interruption would have been unnecessary. And as I returned to the living room, Ashley was explaining something about opening up the kitchen space, her voice regaining some of its earlier confidence, but not fully, not completely, because now there was hesitation, a slight pause between her sentences, as if something in the atmosphere had shifted just enough to make her aware that she might not be as certain as she once was. Daniel glanced at me then, just for a moment, and I held his gaze without expression, without accusation, and that seemed to unsettle him more than any words could have. And when the contractor asked about authorization for structural changes, about permits and ownership verification, Ashley answered quickly, almost too quickly, saying, "We will handle all of that." But I noticed the way her voice tightened slightly at the end, the way her confidence leaned on assumption rather than fact, and I said nothing because this was not the moment to correct her, not the moment to reveal anything. And as the meeting continued, I understood that the shift had already begun, not in a way they could fully see yet, but in the way their certainty was starting to weaken, in the way small questions were beginning to form beneath the surface. And as I stood there, quiet and composed, I realized that everything was moving exactly as it should, because doubt, once introduced, does not disappear, it grows, and I had just given it the space it needed to take hold. The contractor left just before evening, his footsteps fading down the front walkway as the door closed behind him, and the house settled into a quieter kind of tension, one that no longer needed raised voices to be felt, because it lingered in the pauses, in the glances that were no longer avoided but not fully met either. And Ashley stood in the middle of the living room, her arms loosely crossed, as if she were trying to hold on to the confidence she had displayed earlier. But something in her posture had shifted, something less certain, less grounded, and Daniel remained near the window, his hands in his pockets, looking out but not really seeing anything, and I walked in from the hallway with the same steady pace I had carried throughout the day, placing my handbag gently on the table, not interrupting the silence, not filling it, just allowing it to exist long enough for them to feel it fully. Ashley was the first to speak, her voice measured but slightly sharper than before, asking, "How long are you planning to stay?" And I turned to face her, meeting her eyes without hesitation, because there was no reason to avoid anything now, and I answered, "That depends," letting the words rest there without explanation, and it was a simple answer, but it carried more weight than anything I had said previously, because it did not follow the structure she had been expecting. It did not align with the timeline she had already created in her mind, and I could see the moment it unsettled her, the brief tightening of her expression, the quick glance she exchanged with Daniel, as if silently asking whether he understood what I meant. Daniel shifted slightly, clearing his throat before saying, "We just thought it would be easier if everything was settled soon," and his voice lacked the certainty he had tried to project earlier, and I nodded once, acknowledging his words without agreeing to them, and I said, "I agree, clarity is important," and again I offered nothing more, no reassurance, no confirmation, only a statement that could be interpreted in more than one way, and that was enough to introduce something new into the room, not confrontation but uncertainty. Ashley stepped forward slightly, her tone now carrying a hint of impatience beneath the surface, saying, "We have already started making arrangements. It would be better if we knew exactly when you are leaving." And I looked at her calmly, noticing how she emphasized the word leaving, as if saying it more firmly would make it more certain, and I replied, "I understand why you would want that." And I let a small pause follow, not long, just enough for the silence to press gently against her expectations before adding, "But there are a few things that need to be clarified first." And that was the moment everything shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably, because for the first time since that night at the dinner table, I was no longer responding to their assumptions, I was introducing my own terms, and Ashley's expression changed in a way she could not fully control. The confidence she had been holding on to slipping just enough to reveal something underneath it, something closer to concern, and Daniel looked at me again, this time more directly, as if trying to understand a version of me he had not seen before, and I did not explain further, I did not elaborate, because explanation would come later at the right time in the right way, and as I turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving them standing there with questions they had not yet learned how to ask, I knew that the certainty they had built their plans on was no longer stable, and once that foundation begins to shift, everything built on top of it begins to follow. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet, steady beginning that does not announce itself but carries the weight of something inevitable, and I moved through the house early, before either of them had come downstairs, preparing a simple cup of coffee, placing it on the table where I had sat so many mornings before, not out of habit this time but out of intention. Because there are moments that deserve to be met with clarity, not emotion, and when I heard footsteps on the stairs I did not look up immediately, I allowed the silence to settle first, to create the space where words would matter more. Ashley entered the room first, followed by Daniel, both of them pausing slightly when they saw me already seated, already composed, and there was something different in the way they looked at me now, not quite understanding, not quite comfortable, as if they sensed something had shifted but could not yet define it. And Ashley was the one who broke the silence, her voice more cautious than it had been the day before, asking, "What did you mean by things needing to be clarified?" And I lifted my gaze to meet hers, steady and direct, and I said, "It means that before any decisions are made about this house, we need to understand who actually has the authority to make them." And the words were simple, measured, but they landed differently than anything I had said before, because they did not respond to her assumptions, they challenged them. Daniel frowned slightly, stepping forward as if trying to piece together something he had overlooked, and he said, "Mom, this house was Dad's and now it is part of the estate, we just thought." And I raised my hand gently, not to interrupt, but to pause the direction of his thought, and I said, "Edward made sure there would be no confusion about any of this." And I reached into my handbag, removing a folder I had prepared the night before, placing it on the table between us with a calm precision that left no room for misinterpretation, and Ashley's eyes moved to it immediately, her posture tightening as if she understood that whatever was inside would not align with what she had been expecting. "Everything relevant is documented here," I continued. "The properties, the accounts, the ownership," and I did not rush the words, I allowed each one to settle, to be fully understood before the next followed, and Daniel opened the folder slowly, his expression shifting as he read. The confidence he had been leaning on beginning to unravel piece by piece, and Ashley leaned in beside him, her composure slipping in small visible ways, her earlier certainty replaced by something sharper, more unsettled, and for a moment, neither of them spoke because the information did not require explanation. It was clear, precise, and impossible to reinterpret. I stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, simply rising from my chair as I had done countless times before, and I looked at them both, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet finality that did not need to be emphasized, and I said, I will be leaving this house, but not because I was told to, and I paused just long enough for that distinction to be understood, before adding, I am leaving because I choose to, and I picked up my coat, moving toward the door without waiting for a response because none was necessary, and as I stepped outside, the morning air cool and steady around me, I did not look back, not out of defiance, but because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore, and as I walked away, I understood that they had believed they were taking something from me, when in reality, they had only revealed exactly why they never deserved it in the first place.